The rain had swallowed the valley for days, pouring over the roofs, the trees, and the silent heart of the mountains. In his workshop, Elias sat before an unfinished carving, the shape of an angel emerging from a block of cedar. Her wings, only half-formed, seemed caught between flight and surrender. His tools lay scattered, heavy with disuse. The oil lamp beside him hissed as a draft crept in. Its light wavered, softening the edges of his despair. "If there is a plan," he whispered to the storm, "why does it lead me here, alone?" The words broke into the sound of thunder, carried away by wind. He pressed his palms together, though he no longer knew if he was praying or pleading. Outside, the temple bell tolled through the mist. Its tone was slow, patient, eternal, like something that remembered him when he could not remember himself. And in that sound, beneath all the rain, a quiet truth stirred. Even the storm obeys an unseen rhythm. By dawn, the storm had softened into a gray drizzle. The world smelled of pine and wet soil. Elias left his workshop, walking down the slope toward the village. His boots sank into the soft ground. Around him, the forest exhaled steam like a living breath. At the edge of the trail, the small tea house awaited, its paper lanterns glowing faintly through the mist. Inside, Mara sat in her quiet grace, her hands steady as she poured tea. She greeted him without words. The warmth of her presence filled the silence. Elias sat across from her, and together they listened to the rain's patient rhythm on the roof. Finally she spoke. "When the earth is soaked, it is not dying. It is learning to bloom again." He said nothing, but his heart took in her words the way soil takes in water. Night returned quietly. Elias lay awake, listening to the drip of rain from the eaves. Mara's words echoed within him, about storms that feed life rather than destroy. He rose, lit the lamp, and approached the unfinished carving once more. The angel looked back at him, not as a failure, but as a question. He placed his chisel in hand and began to carve, not to finish, but simply to move, to breathe. With each cut, a rhythm formed. The wood responded softly beneath his hands, as though it remembered something sacred he had forgotten. Outside, the storm faded into stillness. The night was no longer heavy. It had become listening. Morning sunlight poured gently through the clouds. Mist floated through the valley like drifting incense. Elias stepped outside, letting the cool air fill his lungs. Every leaf glittered with droplets. For the first time, the silence felt like a friend. He walked the path toward the temple, each step echoing softly through the forest floor. The bell sounded again. Steady, patient, timeless. He didn't pray this time. He only listened. Somewhere in that sound, he felt the pulse of something greater, something that asked only trust. That evening, the workshop glowed with a quiet stillness. The angel now stood completed. Her expression was soft, imperfect, yet full of light. Elias studied her face and understood. She was not carved to show victory, but surrender. The moment one stops fighting and simply allows. He bowed his head. "Maybe this was always your plan," he murmured, "to teach me peace before progress." Outside, the wind brushed against the mountains, carrying the final echo of the bell. He closed his eyes. The silence felt infinite, not empty. The storm had ended, but its lesson remained. Days passed in fragile calm. The rain had gone, leaving behind skies too bright to trust. Elias worked in silence, carving smaller figures, birds, leaves, small altars for neighbors. Yet, even as his hands moved, his heart grew restless. The memory of peace was there, but it flickered like the flame of a lamp running low. One morning, while carving the wing of a dove, his chisel snapped clean in two. The sound struck him harder than it should have. He froze, staring at the broken steel. A strange emptiness rose within him, quiet but deep, like water swallowing light. He set the tool down and leaned against the wall. Was this what patience means? He thought. To build, only to break again? His question went unanswered. Only the whisper of wind replied, slipping through the cracks in the door like the breath of something unseen. That afternoon, he walked the winding path toward the temple. Each step stirred fallen leaves across the ground. The air was sharp, touched by pine and distant smoke. He carried the broken chisel in his pocket, not as a tool, but as a question. The temple rose from the mist like a thought returning. Its stones glistened faintly from last night's dew. He climbed the steps, his breath slow, his heart uncertain. The old monk waited at the gate, sweeping the path with quiet rhythm. When Elias bowed, the monk paused and looked at him, eyes calm as still water. Elias spoke softly. I try to be patient, but everything I build falls apart. The monk smiled. When the seed is buried, it believes it is dying, he said. But that is when the growing begins. Inside the temple courtyard, incense burned in gentle spirals, vanishing into the air like prayer made visible. Elias sat beneath the great cedar tree, holding the broken halves of his chisel. The monk sat beside him in silence. Master, Elias asked at last, what if I'm not meant to carve anymore? The monk closed his eyes, then spoke as if to the wind. When the hand forgets its purpose, let the heart remember. The art is not in the tool, it is in the breath that guides it. Elias turned the metal pieces in his hands, light catching their fractured edges. For the first time, he saw not failure, but reflection. Outside the temple, the wind carried fallen leaves across the courtyard. Their soft rustle sounded like 1,000 small voices whispering, "Begin again." That night, Elias dreamt of his father. The old man stood before him in the same workshop, carving by candlelight. Each stroke of his chisel sounded like a heartbeat. Elias tried to speak, but his father only smiled and said, "The hands learn, but the heart remembers." When Elias awoke, dawn light spilled across the floorboards. The dream lingered, warm and sorrowful. He walked to the window and opened it wide. The mountains stretched before him, shrouded in silver mist. He felt his father's presence not as a ghost, but as a quiet reminder. Faith was something passed down like breath, unseen, yet eternal. By afternoon, Elias returned to his bench. The broken chisel lay before him, now cleaned and polished, though still unusable. He did not try to mend it. Instead, he placed it beside the angel carving, a symbol of surrender rather than defeat. He sat for a long time, eyes closed, breathing with the wind that moved through the open door. Somewhere far away, a bird sang its first note of spring. Elias smiled faintly. Maybe patience is not waiting for answers, he murmured. Maybe it is learning to trust what unfolds. And as he spoke, the light shifted. For a fleeting instant, it felt as though the world itself had paused to listen. The morning was clear, washed clean by rain. Sunlight slipped between pine branches, scattering like gold dust over the earth. Elias followed the narrow forest trail toward the river, carrying a small basket of wood scraps. He walked not in search of anything, only to move, to breathe, to feel alive again. Halfway down the slope, he heard a faint cry, a sound so small it could have been mistaken for the wind. He stopped, listening. The cry came again, fragile and uneven. Following it, he found a boy crouched near a fallen sparrow, his hands cupped gently around the trembling creature. The boy looked up, eyes wide, voice barely a whisper. It fell from the nest. I think it's hurt. Something within Elias stirred. The boy's eyes held no fear, only care. The kind born from faith, too young to question. They carried the bird to Elias's workshop. The boy followed silently, his bare feet leaving small wet prints on the path. Inside, Elias placed the sparrow on a folded cloth near the window where sunlight pooled. The bird's wing was bent but not broken. The boy watched with quiet focus as Elias tore a strip of linen and gently wrapped the wing. Will it fly again? The boy asked. Elias hesitated. Maybe, he said softly. Sometimes wings heal slower than hearts. The boy smiled faintly. But they still heal, right? Elias looked at him, a question and an answer shared in one gaze. Yes, he said. They still heal. Days passed, and the boy began visiting every morning. Together, they fed the sparrow crumbs, water and patience. Its wing trembled now and then, testing new strength. The boy would laugh each time, his joy filling the silent room. Elias found himself smiling too, not at progress, but at presence. The boy's laughter reminded him of something sacred. The world does not need to hurry to be whole. One morning, as the sparrow fluttered weakly across the table, Elias whispered, "It's learning again." The boy nodded, eyes bright. Maybe it never forgot. Elias turned to the window. Outside, sunlight spilled through the trees. For the first time in a long while, he believed that faith could return quietly, like wings remembering flight. That afternoon, they carried the sparrow outside. The air was warm, filled with the scent of moss and cedar. The boy opened his hands carefully. The bird perched on his palm, blinking at the sun. For a long moment it stayed still, then beat its wings once, twice, and lifted weakly into the air. Elias felt something inside him rise with it. The boy laughed aloud, a sound pure as light. The bird didn't fly far, only to the low branch of a pine nearby. But in that small flight, there was enough hope to fill a lifetime. The boy turned to Elias. "See, I told you it would fly." Elias smiled. "Yes," he said quietly, "you were right." As the sun dipped low, Elias and the boy sat by the riverbank, watching ripples dance across the water. The sparrow's song drifted faintly through the trees. The boy skipped a stone, its rings spreading wide. "Do you think God planned all of this?" he asked. Elias looked at the river, then at the boy. "Maybe not every stone," he said, "but maybe he planned the ripples." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "That's enough, then." Elias smiled, his reflection wavering on the water's surface beside the child's. For the first time, he no longer sought to understand the plan. It was enough to feel it moving, quiet, unseen, but always kind. The forest had turned gentle with spring. Each morning, mist drifted low through the trees like slow-moving breath. The sound of water trickling from melting snow filled the valley with a rhythm older than words. Elias walked the familiar path to Mara's tea house, carrying a small carving wrapped in cloth. When he arrived, she was sweeping fallen petals from the wooden porch. Her movements were unhurried, almost meditative. He placed the carving before her. A sparrow in flight. "The boy helped me make this," he said softly. Mara smiled, tracing the grain of the wood with her finger. "The wings know when to rest and when to rise," she said. "It is not effort that teaches them. It is stillness." Elias bowed his head, understanding only a little, but feeling as though he had heard a prayer. Mara poured tea with slow precision, her hands moving as though guided by wind and memory. Elias watched as steam rose from the cups, swirling and vanishing before it could be touched. "Do you ever tire of waiting?" he asked. She smiled. "Waiting is not idleness," she said. "It is the space where life gathers strength." She gestured toward the tea. Leaves steep in silence, yet their stillness changes the water. Elias lifted his cup, letting the warmth fill his palms. The taste was simple, earthy, patient, alive. For the first time, he understood. Some transformations happen only in quiet. Days turned into weeks. The boy no longer came as often, for the sparrow had long returned to the sky. Elias spent his mornings carving slowly, his afternoons walking the forest trails. The rush that once drove his hands had quieted. Sometimes he sat beside the river for hours, carving nothing, thinking nothing. The current spoke to him in ripples and reflections. It told him stories of stones worn smooth by surrender, of water that never resisted its path. Mara's words returned to him. Then, stillness is not the absence of movement, but the presence of peace. He smiled, watching sunlight glimmer across the water's surface. He had stopped asking for signs. The world itself had become one. One afternoon, Elias found himself back at the workshop, shaping a piece of cedar with no intention but joy. The wood released its fragrance with each stroke, rich and warm. He no longer measured progress by completion. He carved as one might breathe. Mara visited, standing quietly in the doorway. "It seems your hands have learned silence," she said. He paused, smiling faintly. "No," he replied. "They've learned to listen." She nodded, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "Then the plan is already unfolding." The wind passed through the open window, scattering sawdust into the light like small stars. That evening, Elias walked up to the ridge above the village. The sun was setting behind the mountains, spilling gold across the valley. He could see the temple bell glinting in the distance, catching the last light. He sat beneath a pine tree and closed his eyes. The world was silent except for the faint whisper of wind through branches. For the first time, he felt no pull to move, no ache to understand. He breathed deeply, letting the air fill and leave him without effort. In that stillness, something wordless awakened. Not a revelation, but a remembering. The plan he sought was not written in the stars, nor spoken in prayer. It was living quietly within him, waiting to be noticed. The first cool winds of summer drifted down the valley, carrying the scent of pine, resin, and rain. Elias worked in his workshop, shaping the edge of a cedar door frame when a sharp knock sounded. Outside stood a traveler. Dust-covered cloak, parchment scroll in hand. "They come from the High Temple," the man said. "They seek a craftsman for the Great Restoration. The carvings of the inner sanctum." Elias's hand froze on the chisel. His breath quickened, the air heavy between wonder and fear. "Why me?" he asked quietly. The traveler smiled faintly. "Because patience leaves fingerprints." Elias said nothing. He looked toward the half-open door where sunlight poured in, warm, familiar, forgiving. For a long moment, he said nothing. Sometimes destiny knocks when the heart is still learning to open. "Orb, pound, Kawait." Elias sat at the tea house later that day, the sealed parchment untouched before him. Mara poured tea slowly, her movements calm as ever. "Why hesitate?" she asked gently. "I'm not ready," he replied. "I've only just found peace. To return to ambition feels like losing it." Mara smiled, her eyes deep with knowing. Peace that cannot walk into the world is only half awake. The seed grows not to stay in soil, but to reach the sun. Elias looked down at the letter, its wax seal glinting in the light. He didn't yet know if he was ready, but he sensed that readiness was not required, only fate. That night, Elias could not sleep. The wind pressed softly against the shutters, whispering through the cracks like memory. He rose, lit his lamp, and unrolled the parchment. The temple's seal glimmered faintly in the lamplight. Inside, the letter was simple. An invitation to carve the altar of renewal. His heart pounded. He traced the inked words with trembling fingers, then set it down. He walked to the angel carving that had started it all. Her expression, still imperfect, met his gaze with calm grace. He understood then. It wasn't about skill. It was about surrender. The divine plan never asks for perfection, only willingness. The following morning, Elias walked through the village toward the temple road. Word had spread quickly. The craftsman chosen for the Great Restoration was leaving. Neighbors waved, offering quiet blessings. The boy ran to him, holding a feather in his small hand. "For luck," he said simply. Elias smiled, tucking it into his cloak. "Then I'll carry your faith with me." As he reached the edge of the forest, Mara waited beneath the gate. She bowed slightly. "The fruit ripens when it is ready," she said. He returned her bow. "And I have finally learned to wait." Then he turned toward the mountain road, and with every step, the sound of the temple bell followed him. Deep, steady, eternal. As the sun climbed higher, Elias reached the ridge where forest met sky. He paused, gazing down at the world he was leaving. The tea house, the workshop, the slow-turning river. Everything he loved was small from here, yet no less sacred. He placed his hand on his heart and whispered, "Thank you for the delay." For he saw now that every unanswered prayer, every silence, every detour was part of the shaping. The wood of his soul had needed time to cure before it could hold what was divine. Then, without looking back, Elias stepped forward, not chasing destiny, but walking beside it. The great temple stood upon the upper cliffs, carved from white stone that shimmered in the sunlight. When Elias arrived, the courtyard was silent except for the slow beat of prayer drums in the distance. The air smelled of cedar resin, smoke, and mountain wind. The monk greeted him at the gate with a faint smile. "You have come at last," he said. Elias bowed deeply. "I came as soon as I understood," he replied. The monk nodded. "Understanding is what takes time." Elias followed him through echoing corridors, each wall lined with carvings older than memory. His steps fell in rhythm with the monks. For the first time, he felt no fear, no urgency. He was not late, only right on time. Inside the sanctum, sunlight streamed through lattice windows, scattering across the dust like 1,000 quiet stars. Elias ran his hand over the smooth temple walls, feeling the history beneath his fingertips. The monk spoke softly beside him. "You will carve here," he said. "This place has waited long for hands that listen." Elias knelt, bowing his head. The weight of the chisel in his hand felt familiar, yet new, like meeting an old friend reborn. He pressed the blade gently against the stone, and with the first stroke he felt it. Creation without self. Each sound of carving was a heartbeat. Each chip that fell away was something he no longer needed to carry. Days turned into weeks, and Elias worked in rhythm with the world itself. He rose with dawn, carved through light and shadow, and stopped when the bell sounded each evening. The temple walls grew alive with form, wings, rivers, petals, all drawn from his memory of silence. The monk watched from afar, never speaking unless silence had already said enough. Sometimes he would leave small cups of tea by Elias's side, sometimes a feather or a seed, quiet gifts, reminders of presence. And in the still hours of carving, Elias began to see the same divine patience that healed the sparrow was now guiding his hands. One evening, after a long day of work, Elias stepped outside onto the temple terrace. The valley below was bathed in gold, and the wind carried the scent of pine and prayer incense. He sat by the railing, watching the sun dissolve into the horizon. The boy's feather rested in his pocket. He took it out, turning it between his fingers. The world around him glowed with perfect silence. He realized that patience was not waiting for life to happen. It was trusting that it already was. Behind him, the monk's voice came softly. "Do you see it now?" Elias smiled. "I do. The plan was never hidden, only my heart was closed." By the time the final carving was done, the temple's sanctum seemed to breathe. Light touched every line, filling each shape with living warmth. Elias stood before his work. The image of a great unfolding lotus, its petals spiraling toward the heavens. He bowed deeply. "Thank you," he whispered, though he no longer knew to whom, to God, to time, to every delay that had shaped him. The monk approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "This," he said, "is not the end. It is only the flowering." And in that moment, Elias felt it completely. The plan had never been beyond him. It had been carving him all along. The temple bells rang in the early morning air, their tones rolling across the valley like slow waves of light. The restoration was complete. Villagers gathered below, faces lifted toward the newly carved sanctum. Elias stood in the upper hall, watching sunlight sweep across the lotus he had carved, its petals glowing with quiet fire. He felt no pride, only stillness. The work did not belong to him. It had passed through him. Every chisel mark, every hour of doubt, every moment of waiting. All had become one single prayer. As he looked upon his creation, he finally saw what Mara once meant. Peace that can walk into the world is alive. The monk's voice echoed behind him. You carved not stone, Elias, but time itself. Later that day, Elias descended the stone steps of the temple and walked among the villagers. They thanked him, bowed, offered food, but he only smiled. I did not make this, he said quietly. It was waiting to be found. Mara stood at the edge of the crowd, hands folded. When he approached, she placed a small cup of tea in his hand, the same kind she had served when he first came in despair. You have learned, she said softly. Not everything grows fast. Some truths bloom in years. He bowed his head, gratitude heavy in his chest. And some, he said, bloom only when we stop asking to see the sea. That evening, Elias returned to the ridge overlooking the valley. The sky burned in hues of copper and rose. He watched the clouds drift slowly above the temple roofs, feeling the rhythm of everything, the wind, the trees, his own breath, merging into one silent harmony. From below came a sound, the laughter of the... He turned to see the child running toward him, the same sparrow fluttering close behind. The bird landed near Elias's feet, chirping as if to greet an old friend. He smiled, kneeling beside it. You found your sky again, he whispered. The boy nodded, eyes bright. And so did you. As twilight deepened, the monk stood at the temple gate, watching Elias from afar. He did not call out, for there was nothing left to teach. The wind carried the fragrance of cedar and tea, and with it, the sound of the boy's laughter echoing like music. The monk closed his eyes, whispering into the wind. The plan was never hidden. It was always becoming. He smiled, turned, and disappeared into the temple's shadow. The valley fell into dusk, but the world seemed brighter still. Night came gently. Elias and the boy sat beneath the stars, the sparrow asleep beside them. The forest whispered with life. Leaves, rivers, unseen wings, all breathing together in sacred rhythm. Elias looked up at the sky. The stars seemed arranged in patterns too vast to follow, yet perfectly placed. He smiled, understanding at last that the same hand guiding the constellations had guided his path. Through storms, silences, and waiting, he closed his eyes and whispered, everything was the plan. The boy leaned against him, and the night answered not with sound but with peace, deep, infinite, and complete.